Welcome back to NewsX World. I'm Joshua Barnes and you're watching Focal Length, where we give you a briefing on topics from across the world. China is attempting to significantly expand its maritime territories. What are the South China Sea tensions? How can it impact the Indo-Pacific region's dynamic? What is the conflict between Taiwan and China? And how can Taiwan be prepared against China? Should nuclear power be utilised? And should the focus be shifted to other regional crises? Let's find out. Joining us is Captain James Fanell, who is a former US Naval intelligence officer. He retired from the Navy in 2015 and is currently a government fellow at the Geneva Centre for Security Policy in Switzerland. Thank you for joining us, Captain James Fanell. My first question to you is, you have been extensively studying the Chinese Navy's expansion to forcefully take over maritime territories in the Indo-Pacific region. Could you tell us more about the current status of the Chinese PLA Navy?
Well, the current state of the PLA Navy is that they're at their peak power since the history of the People's Republic of China. So they have over 400 major combatants, and they have demonstrated not only that they can build a large number of warships and submarines, but they're actually using them very extensively. So on a daily basis now, we are seeing Chinese warships operate around Taiwan, for instance, on a daily basis that they would never have done just 3 or 4 years ago. In the last year, their first indigenously produced aircraft carrier and their second carrier, called the Shandong CV-17, it operated over 4 times in the Western Pacific and the Philippine Sea east of Taiwan, conducting flight operations and conducting over thousands of aircraft launch and recoveries and sorties. And they did that not just by themselves, but they did them with their new carrier strike group formations that include the most advanced surface combatant in the world, the Type 055 cruiser that has 112 vertical launch system cells that can launch supersonic anti-ship cruise missiles like the YJ-18 and a plethora of surface-to-air missiles and other weapons. So it's a very potent cruiser that goes along and protects the aircraft carrier along with other Type 052 Delta, Langhai, Luoyang 3 class destroyers that also have a number of vertical launch missiles and some frigates and other things. So they're operating together as carrier strike groups, very much like the United States Navy or the Indian Navy. And they've been practicing that. Even last year, the Shandong sailed near Guam. So they were operating from the east coast of Taiwan near Guam. So they're clearly having an advantage and have built their force to be able to operate with impunity throughout the first and second island chain. But also the Chinese Navy has operated, as you and the Indian folks should know, in the Gulf of Aden and the Gulf of Oman for the last 15 years. Since December of 2008, the Chinese have had a continuous everyday presence, 365 days a year, 24/7, of at least 3 combatants in the Gulf of Aden, usually a large destroyer, a fast cruiser, both guided missiles types, and then a comprehensive resupply ship. And they've been operating there, escorting Chinese-flagged merchant vessels through the Gulf of Aden and into the Red Sea. And as the world has watched, the Houthi rebels have now, since 7 October, been attacking international shipping in the Gulf of Aden and also in the Red Sea. The United States has been trying to lead a coalition, they've named it Operation Prosperity Guardian, to help the world's international shipping get through the Red Sea without being attacked by these Houthi rebels that are firing all sorts of weaponry at commercial vessels and warships.
Could you shed light on the 64-page testimony you provided to the House Permanent Select Committee on the Intel hearing on China's worldwide military expansion?
Well, I actually haven't read that report yet, so I'm not exactly able to comment on the specifics of the report. But what I can say is that in keeping with what I've been following from the Congress and and what I know of what the Chinese military expansion is that there's a great concern that China's military, not just their Navy, but the rest of their military is expanding at a great rate. For instance, since Xi Jinping has come to power, he's transformed the PLA greatly. And so in this last year, in 2015, he did some major work where he reduced the number of military regions to 5 theater commands, which are more like U.S. military, U.S. combatant command organization. So they're joint in function. So you'll see PLA Navy, PLA Air Force, PLA Army, rocket forces, and strategic support forces, which are their cyber forces and space forces, along with logistics forces, all operating together now in these theater commands that are, geographically oriented to defend Taiwan, or to defend China ostensibly, but also to be used to project power against India, for instance, in the Southern Theater Command, or in the Eastern Theater Command against Taiwan, or in the Northern Theater Command against South Korea or Japan. So these theater commands that have been created are not benign, internally focused commands. They're externally focused, one. And two, now they're operating as a joint fighting force. And then probably important that your audience understands is that just in this year, right before the National People's Congress, China announced the appointment of a new Minister of Defense. And for the first time in the history of the People's Republic of China, the PRC's Ministry of Defense will be led by a Navy Admiral, Admiral Dong. And Admiral Dong is interesting admiral, first because he's an admiral and they've never had an admiral leave the PLA. Secondly, he was, over 10 years ago, he was the first officer in charge of the East China Sea Joint Command Center. And this was an initial Joint Command Center that predated Xi's reorganization in 2015, but it was an effort to bring together joint forces, Air Force, Navy, Army, all of these forces. And he was the first commander of that Joint Command Center. And so I think what you should take away from that, the audience should take away from it, is that now you have an officer in charge of.
Is it time for the US to recalibrate and rebuild their Navy to a level that matches China's projected naval strength?
That's been my recommendation, these past 20 plus years, is that it's time for the United States to recognize that America was able to, essentially defeat the enemies of World War II by having and being built upon having a strong Navy. We're a maritime nation. I think India is a maritime nation. So maritime power is critically important. And unfortunately, going back to 1991 with Operation Desert Storm and then 9/11 in September of 2001, the United States has been preoccupied with what in this book that you can see behind me called Embracing Communist China, America's Greatest Strategic Failure, that my co-author, Dr. Bradley Thayer, and I just published. In this book, we talk about being that our leaders were distracted by what we have labeled minor wars. Now, those wars were not minor for those who died in them, no way. But they were minor in terms of the strategic threats and the strategic survival of the United States and freedom and liberty and democracy. And so we failed as a nation to perceive the rise of China for a lot of reasons that we go to in the book, but we failed to recognize that threat, and thus we failed to prepare for it. So now we're in a bad situation because China's Navy is it's larger than the U.S. Navy today. Our Navy is spread around the world. Theirs is highly concentrated in the Western Pacific and Indian Oceans. So they have a much more larger military impact in those regions, if you will. And for us to catch up with them is going to take some time. And as a recent slide from the Office of Naval Intelligence in the last year indicated, that China has over 250 times the naval ship production capability as the United States.
Should Taiwan be equipped with nuclear power to deter China?
Well, in our book, we talk about several recommendations that need to occur. And because of this mismatch, this change in the status quo. You've probably heard the term status quo. It was talked about a lot over the last 30 years that we wanted to maintain the military status quo, the balance of power in the cross-strait relationship between Beijing and Taiwan, or PRC and Taiwan. Well, unfortunately, over the last 30 years, China has dramatically altered that status quo. And we've talked about conventional forces, but as we also mentioned, the nuclear forces. So China has escalated the situation in East Asia and in the cross-strait relationship. They've built these nuclear ICBM silos in the last 3 years, dramatic growth. They've already assessed, if you go back to 2012, there were already assessments that China had 3,000 miles of underground tunnels, part of which would store their nuclear arsenal. And then, as I said, they've expanded into their strategic bomber force that they're creating today, and they've also advanced productions in ballistic missile submarines. So they have escalated both conventionally and nuclear the threat against Taiwan. And because of our conventional disparity and the time that it would take to build a Navy and Air Force, the United States and Taiwan at least should start the negotiations publicly about how we could provide nuclear protection for Taiwan.
Do you think it's a good sign that the global focus has shifted from the South China Sea to the wars in the Middle East and Ukraine?
Well, I think clearly what's happening in Gaza and in the Red Sea is you can't ignore it. It's a very serious and significant region. Obviously, for America, Israel is a longstanding ally and the only democracy in the region. And so it's something that obviously we're concerned from a humanitarian standpoint, but also in terms of the world and the global economy, shutting down the Red Sea or greatly reducing the flow in the Red Sea to only those ships that are Chinese or Russian, oh, by the way, is a great concern because it disrupts global supply systems, global food product or deliveries and things of that nature. So I understand why the world would shift attention there, but I don't think they should also ignore what's happening in the South China Sea. $5 trillion worth of goods and services go through the South China Sea. So it's an important region for the world as well. And you know, in kind of in a larger sense, the freedom of navigation on the high seas is a principle that we cannot allow a communist nation like China to just say we're gonna decide when waterways are open or closed, and we're gonna be the arbiters of freedom of navigation. That's not acceptable in the international order. And so we nations that don't or stand with the freedom of navigation, we need to be firm in that position, and we need to guard it everywhere it's being challenged.
Thank you, Captain James Fanell, for speaking to us on Focal Length. With that, it's a wrap on the episode. For more international news updates, stay tuned on NewsX World.